There's something almost alive about the way the leaves of the Whispering Willow tremble in the dim light of the Hogwarts greenhouse, not just from the breeze, but as if they're holding their breath, waiting to share a secret. If you've ever stood close to a plant and felt that strange, quiet pull, as though it might whisper to you if you listened closely enough, then you already understand the magic that drew young Elara Thornbrook into her most dangerous experiment yet. Tonight, we're stepping into her world, where every root and petal hums with hidden power, and even the most careful herbology apprentice can find herself tangled in a mystery far deeper than she ever imagined. But before we begin, tell us, where are you joining from tonight, and what time is it where you are? Let us know in the comments below, because there's something special about knowing we're all exploring this together, no matter the hour. Alara's hands were steady as she reached for the Whispering Willow that evening, but her heart raced like a snitch let loose in the great hall. Professor Sprout's warnings echoed in her mind. This plant wasn't just rare, it was unpredictable, its magic woven into every rustling leaf like a spell half finished. Yet curiosity had always been Alara's weakness, or perhaps her greatest strength. She'd spent months sketching its strange, curling vines in the margins of her textbooks, noting how its flowers seemed to glow faintly under the moonlight, as if charged with starlight. And so, with a flick of her wand and a whispered incantation, she began to document its properties in secret, unaware that the plant was documenting her right back. The air in the greenhouse thickened as the willow's leaves began to shiver, not from wind, but from something far more unsettling recognition. It said that magical plants have a way of choosing who they reveal themselves to, and tonight, the willow had chosen Alara. Soft murmurs curled through the air, too faint to decipher, but too deliberate to ignore. Was it sharing secrets or testing her? That's the thing about Hogwarts' most mysterious flora. They don't just grow, they listen. They remember, and as Alara leaned closer, her quill scratching furiously across parchment, she couldn't have known that her notes would unravel a mystery buried deep in the castle's roots, one that would lead her far beyond the greenhouse walls. So let's turn the page together, shall we? Because the story of the Whispering Willow is only the beginning. The glow from the Whispering Willow was so faint at first that Alara thought her eyes were playing tricks. But as midnight crept closer, the leaves pulsed with a soft silver light, like moonlight caught in spider silk. Then came the sound, not a rustle, but something deeper, a vibration that made the glass panes of the greenhouse hum in sympathy. Her enchanted quill hovered above the journal of its own accord, sketching frantic notes as the willow's branches swayed in a rhythm no wind could explain. That's when it happened. A single brush of her sleeve against the trunk sent a cascade of shimmering pollen into the air, swirling around her like living mist. The moment it touched her skin, the greenhouse erupted into sound, not the usual creaks and sighs of plants growing, but voices, whispers tangled in the roots of the flutterby bushes, murmurs trapped in the petals of the dirigible plums. The snargaluff vines hissed warnings to one another about overwatering, while the young mandrakes grumbled sleepily in their pots. Alara gasped, clutching the edge of the work table as the sheer weight of it all crashed over her. For generations, herbologists had relied on observation and spellwork to interpret plant behavior, but this was a direct conversation. The implications spun through her mind like a golden snitch in flight. Imagine diagnosing a sickly plant by simply asking it where it hurt, or negotiating with Devil's Snare before it could strike. The Whispering Willow had given her a key to an entirely new branch of magic. Yet even as wonder flooded her, a darker thought took root. The ministry regulated magical plants for a reason. What would happen if someone less scrupulous learned to harness this ability? The pollen's effect was already fading. She could feel the voices growing dimmer, slipping through her fingers like water. But the knowledge of its existence was enough to make her blood run cold. Some secrets weren't meant to be uncovered, and some doors, once opened, couldn't be closed. The last thing she saw before fleeing the greenhouse was the willow itself, its glow deepening to an eerie gold, as if it were watching her and smiling. Dawn had barely touched the castle spires when Professor Sprout pushed open the greenhouse door, her boots crunching over a scatter of soil that shouldn't have been there. The morning light caught something strange near Alara's usual workstation, a single leaf, luminescent as a fallen star, pulsing faintly on the stone floor. The professor knelt, her breath hitching as she pinched it between thumb and forefinger. It was warm, alive, and unmistakably from the Whispering Willow. Alara's stomach dropped when she was summoned to Sprout's office later that day. The professor's usual twinkle had hardened into something sharper as she placed the leaf between them on the desk. "Some magics," she said slowly, tracing the leaf's veins with her wand, "grow in the dark for a reason." The words hung like mist over the black lake, heavy with unspoken meaning. No direct accusation came, no detention assigned, but the warning was clear: stop digging. Yet as Alara paced the Gryffindor common room that evening, guilt gnawing at her ribs, another feeling burned brighter. The willow had spoken to her, not in metaphors or riddles, but in voices as real as the fire crackling in the hearth. What if this wasn't just about hearing plants? What if it was about listening to the very magic woven into Hogwarts stones? The thought sent a thrill down her spine, reckless and irresistible. By moonrise, she stood once more before the greenhouse door, her breath fogging the glass as she peered inside. The willow's branches stirred, though the air was still, almost like an invitation. Her fingers trembled as she turned the handle, not with fear, but with the electric certainty that she stood on the edge of something vast. The leaf's glow had been a beacon, the professor's warning, a signpost, and the whispers waiting in the dark. Those, she suspected, were only the beginning. The restricted section had always felt different after dark, not just quiet, but watchful, as if the books themselves held their breath when someone crossed the threshold. Alara's pulse hammered in her throat as she crept past the rope barrier, her wand casting the faintest lumos to guide her. She wasn't even sure what she was searching for until her fingers brushed against a spine wrapped in what felt like was that bark. The tome slid from the shelf with a whisper of protest, its cover etched with runes that seemed to squirm under her touch. The Verdant Codex. The title glowed faintly, then faded, as if embarrassed to be caught revealing itself. Inside, the pages weren't paper, but something thicker, veined like leaves, their edges curling slightly as she turned them. The illustrations moved, not like ordinary wizarding photographs, but with the slow, deliberate grace of plants growing. One image in particular seized her attention: a towering tree, its roots coiled around a pulsing orb of light. surrounded by figures in robes that might have been green or might have been woven from living ivy. The caption chilled her. The awakening ritual, to give voice to the voiceless, is to unmake the boundaries between earth and magic. A gust of air stirred the pages just then, though no window stood open. Alara stiffened as the shadows near the shelves thickened, twisting into shapes that almost resembled branches. Then came the sound, a dry, papery rustle, too close, too deliberate. She snapped the book shut, but not before catching one final line. Beware the sleeper beneath. It dreams of sunlight. Back in her dormitory, the words followed her into sleep. In her dreams, the Hogwarts grounds cracked open like an eggshell, and something vast and green and hungry uncurled beneath the foundations, its roots drinking the magic from the castle's stones. She woke gasping, her sheets tangled like vines around her legs. Dawn painted the room in weak light, but the fear clung, because the book had been right about one thing: magic always leaves traces. And as she'd fled the library, she could have sworn she felt something old stirring in the dark behind her. The venomous tentacula had never been what one might call friendly. Its vines usually lashed out at anything that moved, its spiked leaves curling like fists. But when Alara passed its pot 3 mornings after the Willow incident, the plant went still, not frozen, not cautious, but attentive. One thick vine uncoiled slowly, brushing her sleeve with something almost like curiosity before retreating. She barely had time to process it when a rustling chorus rose around her, flutterbee bushes fluttering their leaves in unison, a cluster of dittany stems bending toward her as if straining to hear. Even the Snargaluff, usually too busy muttering insults at passers-by, let out a low, considering hum. Neville Longbottom saw it first. He'd been tending the Mimbulus Mimbletonia in the corner when the greenhouse's usual symphony of creaks and whispers shifted key. Plants didn't just react to Alara, they leaned into her space, leaves shivering like they were catching a draft only she carried. "You've got to tell me what you're doing differently," he blurted out, wiping soil from his hands. "The tentacula nearly took my finger off yesterday, but it's acting like you've got treats in your pockets." Alara forced a laugh, tucking her hands behind her back, where the pollen marks still glowed faintly silver. "Just good lighting today, maybe," but Neville's frown lingered. He knew plants really knew them, and whatever this was, it wasn't sunlight. By week's end, the whispers weren't just in the greenhouse. Crossing the grounds at dusk, Alara paused beneath the Whispering Willow. Its usual furious thrashing slowed, then stilled entirely. Then, beneath the creak of ancient bark, came a sound like syllables, not wind, not wood, but words. Low, guttural, half-formed yet unmistakable. Listen. Her breath hitched. This wasn't just about hearing plants anymore. This was about being heard by them. The willow's groan deepened, branches twisting not in anger, but in effort, as if struggling to shape air into language. That night, the castle itself seemed restless. The staircases shifted more erratically than usual, portraits murmuring behind her as she passed. Peeves lobbed a cluster of dung bombs her way, then abruptly veered off, cackling about, little rootlings tattling to the stones. Even the suits of armor creaked their helms toward her, their empty eyes following her down the corridor. Magic, after all, wasn't just in wands and spells. It was in the walls, the soil, the air. And now, somehow, it was waking up. The idea struck Alara like a stray spell. brilliant, dangerous, and impossible to ignore. If the Whispering Willow's pollen had opened a door, why couldn't she build her own key? Late that night, hunched over her cluttered desk in Gryffindor Tower, she scribbled calculations on parchment, cross-referencing notes from the Verdant Codex with her own hazy memories of the pollen's shimmer. The logic seemed sound, a modified herbivicous charm to accelerate growth, a dash of essence of murtlap for sensitivity, and this was the risky part, a drop of her own blood, still thrumming with traces of the Willow's magic. Just a controlled test, she whispered, stirring the concoction with her wand. The liquid turned iridescent, bubbling with a sound like distant laughter. The greenhouse at midnight was a cathedral of shadows, the glass panes warping the moonlight into strange shapes. Alara's hands shook as she uncorked the vial over a pot of ordinary flutterbee bushes. The first drop hit the soil, and the world seemed to inhale. For a heartbeat, nothing. Then the flutterbee's leaves snapped upright, rigid as soldiers, before exploding into violent growth. Vines shot outward, thick as ropes, their edges serrated like teeth. The plant's usual cheerful rustle became a chorus of hisses, its stems twisting toward her with terrifying purpose. Elara stumbled back, but the other plants were waking now. The venomous tentacula's pot cracked as its vines punched through the ceramic, thudding against the worktable like battering rams. A dirigible plum tree's branches lashed the air, its fruit swelling to the size of cauldrons before bursting in showers of sticky, sweet-smelling mist. Worst of all was the sound, not whispers anymore, but a cacophony of shrieks and groans, as if the greenhouse itself were in pain. She barely dodged a whip-like vine aimed at her ankles, sprinting for the door as the Snargaluff behind her let out a roar that rattled the glass. The wards of Hogwarts reacted instantly. A pulse of magic rippled outward from the greenhouse, visible as a golden ripple in the air. Somewhere in the castle, a bell began to toll. Not the familiar hourly chime, but a deeper, urgent sound that hadn't been heard since the Battle of Hogwarts. Elara made it halfway to the castle before doubling over, her breath ragged. Behind her, the greenhouse roof buckled, silhouetted against the sky like a beast unfurling its spines. By morning, the damage was contained. Professor Sprout and a team of aurors had worked until dawn, their wands weaving spells to calm the frenzied plants. But containment couldn't stop the rumors. Whispers trailed Alara through the corridors like ghosts. Hufflepuffs clutched their herbology textbooks tighter when she passed. Even the suits of armor seemed to track her movements with newfound suspicion. The most damning rumor came from Neville, who'd been woken by the commotion. "They're saying you tried to talk to them," he murmured at breakfast, his eyes darting to her stained sleeves. "Not just listen, like you wanted them to, answer back." Alara's fork clattered to her plate. That was the heart of it, wasn't it? She hadn't just breached a rule. She'd crossed a line magic itself had drawn. Plants were meant to be tended, studied, even befriended, but never understood, not like this. The castle's wards had sensed the imbalance, the way an immune system attacks a foreign invader. And now, something far older than Hogwarts had taken notice. As she left the Great Hall, the gargoyle outside the headmaster's office turned its head just enough to watch her go, its stony mouth curled into something too knowing to be called a smile. The office smelled of earth and something sharper, dried Mimbulus Mimbletonia, sap, maybe, or the bitter tang of crushed girder root. Professor Sprout didn't look up when Alara entered, just motioned to the chair across from her desk, where a single withered leaf lay between them like an accusation. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the creak of the chair as Alara sat, her pulse loud in her ears. This was it, expulsion, the end of everything. But when Sprout finally spoke, her voice wasn't angry, it was tired. I was 23 when I first heard them. Her fingers traced the leaf's brittle edges, not just the willow, all of them. The castle's ivy humming old songs, the forbidden forest's oaks muttering about storms they'd weathered centuries before I was born. She lifted her gaze, and Alara flinched at the shadow there. I thought I discovered something revolutionary. My mentor, Algie Gorsewood, thought so too, until he started insisting the Whispering Willow was begging him for something. It wants sunlight, he'd say, not just light, the idea of it. Then one night, he walked into the greenhouse and Sprout's hand twitched toward a drawer, stopped. We never found his wand, just his boots, filled with soil, as if the earth had swallowed him whole. Alara's throat tightened. She'd read about Gorsewood. The official record said he'd resigned after a nervous breakdown. But this was a warning carved from lived horror. Sprout leaned forward, her usual twinkle replaced by a flinty intensity. Magic has boundaries for a reason, child. Some roots go deeper than we should ever dig. The words should have chilled Alara to the bone, but beneath the fear, something else stirred. A stubborn, traitorous spark. If Sprout had heard the voices too, that meant the magic was real. Not a fluke, not a mistake. And if Gorsewood had vanished, well, hadn't everyone once thought the crumple-horned snorkack was a myth until Luna Lovegood proved them wrong? Sprout must have seen the defiance flicker in her eyes. With a sigh, she slid open the drawer and pulled out a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. Inside lay a vial of murky liquid and a scrap of parchment, so old it crackled at the edges. "Take it," she said, pushing them across the desk. "Gorsewood's notes. Maybe they'll scare sense into you where my words won't." Alara's fingers hovered over the bundle. This wasn't just a warning, it was a test. To open it meant stepping onto a path that had already consumed someone far more experienced than her. But to walk away, that would mean silencing the whispers that had begun to feel less like a secret and more like a calling. The vial glinted in the lamplight, its surface etched with tiny, thorn-like runes. Somewhere in the castle, a pipe groaned, the sound twisting into something almost like laughter. The map in Gorsewood's notes had been cryptic, just a smudge of ink near the edge of the forbidden forest, marked with a single rune that looked like a coiled root. But the deeper Alara wandered into the overgrown thicket behind Hogwarts greenhouses, the more the land itself seemed to guide her. Brambles parted with unnatural ease where she stepped, and twice she caught the distant glint of something silver, a trail of moonlit petals, perhaps, or the eyes of some creature watching from the shadows. Then, between one breath and the next, the trees gave way to a sight that shouldn't have existed. A greenhouse, its glass panes fogged with centuries of neglect, half swallowed by ivy, so thick it looked like the walls were bleeding green. The door groaned open at her touch, the hinges sighing as if relieved to be remembered. Inside, the air hummed, not with the usual chatter of plants, but with something deeper, a vibration that settled in her teeth like the aftershock of a thunderclap. The specimens here weren't just rare, they were impossible. A cluster of orchids glowed like embers in the dimness, their petals shifting color as she passed. Vines as thick as her wrist coiled around rusted watering cans, their thorns oozing a sap that smelled suspiciously like peppermint. And in the center of it all, a single plant pulsed rhythmically, its bulb-like core swelling and contracting like a heartbeat. Elara's fingers hovered over it, trembling. This was the rune from the book. The same shape, the same eerie glow. One touch, and the visions hit like a bludger to the skull. A circle of robed figures, their faces obscured by antlered masks, chanting as roots burst from the earth to weave a cage of living wood. A cauldron, overflowing not with liquid, but with swirling light. And then, pain, a scream, the ritual shattered mid-word, the energy rebounding like a snapped bowstring. The last thing she saw before wrenching her hand away was a sapling, no taller than her knee, its leaves edged in gold, being buried hurriedly in the dark soil. The greenhouse spun around her. She staggered back, gasping, only to freeze as her heel crunched on something brittle. A skeleton. Not human, but something smaller, its bones fused with what looked like petrified vines. A house elf, maybe, or her stomach lurched as she spotted the tiny, rusted gardening trowel still clutched in its fingers. Whoever, whatever this was, it had died tending these plants. Outside, the wind rose, howling through the trees like a warning. But louder still was the sound coming from the pulsating plant. Not a whisper this time. A word, clear as a bell. Finish. The visions didn't fade this time. They clung to Elara's mind like ivy to stone, each leaf and shadow etched with impossible clarity. She saw them now, the witches and wizards of that forgotten age. Their robes stitched with living vines, their wands carved from branches that still sprouted fresh buds. They didn't command the plants, they listened, their magic woven into a partnership as delicate as mycorrhizal threads beneath the soil. The air in those visions shimmered with shared understanding, a harmony so profound it made her chest ache. But then, the shift. A crack in the symbiosis, a hunger that twisted the bond. The plants grew ravenous, their roots drinking magic like water, their tendrils snatching spells midair and swallowing them whole. Trees uprooted themselves to stride across battlefields, their bark splitting into mouths that screamed in tongues no human could parse. The wizards fought back, of course. Fires raged, curses flew, but the plants learned, adapted. A single drop of venom from a mutated tentacula could rot a wand to splinters. The final image burned brightest, a circle of elders burying something not a seed, but a memory, deep beneath the oldest oak, chanting spells not of growth, but of forgetting. Elara staggered back, the greenhouse's glass walls pressing in around her. The Whispering Willow wasn't just a rare specimen, it was a relic, a survivor of that purged era. And her experiments, they weren't innovation, they were archaeology, digging up graves better left sealed. The realization hit like a hex, the pollen, the voices, the way the venomous tentacula had watched her with something too sharp to be instinct. It wasn't just reaction. It was recognition. Around her, the plants trembled, not the usual rustle of leaves in drafty air, but a collective shiver, as if the greenhouse itself had drawn breath. The flutterby bushes folded their foliage into tight, defensive spirals. The dirigible plums swelled to twice their size, their skins splitting to release a scent like burnt sugar. Even the soil seemed to shift, grains of dirt skittering away from her boots as though repelled. Then came the whisper, not from the willow this time, but from the very air, a voice like wind through dead grass. "You remember us." The words weren't spoken. They unfolded, petals of sound blooming inside her skull. Alara pressed her palms to her ears, but it didn't help. The knowledge was in her now, a root taking hold. The plants hadn't just been allies or enemies in that ancient war. They'd been something far worse, right? And the wizards who buried that truth, they'd done it not to protect people from the plants, but the plants from them. A crumble of dirt pattered onto the floorboards. She looked up. The Whispering Willow's branches were stretching, not toward her, but past her, reaching for the greenhouse door. Toward the castle, toward the sleeping students inside. The vision's final piece snapped into place. The elders hadn't just buried the memory, they'd buried a warning. And now, thanks to her, it was digging itself free. Neville's voice cracked through the greenhouse like a whip. "Elara, stop." She spun, heart hammering, to find him framed in the doorway, his face pale under the flickering glow of the bioluminescent orchids. His usual calm had shattered. His hands trembled where they gripped the door frame, and his robes were smudged with dirt, as if he'd sprinted through the forbidden forest to reach her. He didn't wait for an explanation. "I've been tracking your notes," he said, stepping closer, his boots crunching over ancient potting shards. "At first, I thought you just borrowed some advanced herbology texts. But then the venomous tentacula started humming when you passed. The Whispering Willow spoke to you." His breath hitched. "Alara, that's not possible, not without." She braced for the accusation. Cheating, dark magic. But Neville's next words were softer, heavier. "Not without waking things that should stay buried." He pulled a tattered scroll from his pocket, a page torn from the Verdant Codex, its edges singed. The illustration showed a tree, its roots coiled around a wizard's skeleton. The caption screaming in bold, faded ink. The first war was not against wands, but leaves. Alara's throat tightened. She'd seen that image in her visions. But Neville shouldn't have known. "Where did you, my gran?" he interrupted, voice rough. "She burned most of Algy's research after what happened, but I found this hidden in her gardening journal." She wrote beside it, "The earth remembers." His fingers brushed the page, tracing a line Alara hadn't noticed before. A tiny, inked sapling, identical to the pulsing plant behind her. "You're not the first to hear them, and the others, they didn't stop listening in time." The greenhouse seemed to hold its breath. Even the rustling vines stilled, as if waiting for her choice. Elara glanced at the pulsating plant, its golden veins throbbing in sync with her own pulse. She'd come so far. The answers were right there. Neville grabbed her wrist. Not roughly, but with a grip that spoke of years pulling friends from danger. "It's not just about rules," he whispered. "The castle's wards reacted for a reason. Magic has allergies, defenses, and whatever you're digging up." His gaze flicked to the skeletal remains near her feet. "Hogwarts is trying to sneeze it back out." A shudder ran through the ground then, subtle as a sigh. The plants around them let out a collective exhale, their leaves curling inward, not in fear, but anticipation. Elara's fingers hovered over the vial of her homemade pollen key, still warm in her pocket. Neville's plea hung between them, raw and real, but beneath it, fainter than a spider's footstep, came another sound, the whisper of roots shifting beneath the soil. stretching toward the castle like arrows knocked in a bow. The choice wasn't just about curiosity and amour. It was about what happened when the arrows let fly. The air in the greenhouse thickened, pressing against Alara's skin like a living thing as she stepped toward the Whispering Willow. Neville's warnings still echoed in her ears, but the plant's murmurs had coiled around her thoughts, insistent as roots seeking water. Just one question, she whispered, fingers brushing the willow's trunk, and the world erupted. The whispers weren't whispers anymore. They swelled into a chorus, 1,000 voices layered over one another, words splintering into sounds that weren't meant for human ears. The glass panes of the greenhouse rattled in their frames, and the dirt beneath her feet shuddered. Then the vines came, not the slow, exploratory tendrils she'd seen before, but lashing ropes of greenery that shot from the soil like serpents striking. They wrapped around her ankles with terrifying precision, their grip cold and unyielding as iron shackles. Across the greenhouse, plants stirred to life with a violence that turned her blood to ice. The flutterby bushes didn't flutter, they hissed, their leaves snapping like whips. The venomous tentaculous vines uncoiled with a speed she'd never seen, their thorns glistening with something thicker than sap. Even the innocent-looking dirigible plums swiveled toward her, their stems creaking as they strained against their pots, fruit splitting open to reveal rows of seed teeth. Neville shouted her name again, but the sound was swallowed by the willow's chant, now deafening, rhythmic, less like speech and more like the heartbeat of something vast waking beneath the earth. The vines around her legs tightened, dragging her down, not to the ground, into it. The soil parted like water, swallowing her knees, then her thighs, as if the earth itself had decided she belonged underground. Somewhere beyond the chaos, Neville was moving, his wand flashing as he slashed at the vines. But for every one he severed, 2 more erupted in its place. The plants weren't just attacking, they were coordinating. The tentacula lashed out to knock his wand from his hand, while the snargle of vines wove a living net between him and Alara, their thorns biting into his robes like teeth. Elara clawed at the soil, her fingers sinking uselessly into the loosened earth. The willow's bark pressed against her palm, pulsing with heat, not just alive. Awake and angry, the last thing she saw before the dirt closed over her chest was Neville's horrified face, and the Whispering Willow's branches arching toward the castle like drawn bows. Then the darkness took her, thick and sweet as buried honey, and the chant followed her down. You remember, now they will too. The vines coiled tighter around Alara's legs, dragging her deeper into the soil, its damp chill seeping through her robes like an unwelcome embrace. She gasped, clawing at the earth, but every handful she pulled away was replaced by twice as much, the ground itself conspiring against her. Across the greenhouse, Neville fought like a man possessed. His wand slashed through the air, severing vines with quick, desperate strokes, but the plants were learning. Dodging his curses, they twisted midair like snakes, evading a mongoose, their thorns glistening with something far darker than dew. A stray hex hit a flutterby bush, and instead of withering, it shuddered, its leaves hardening into jagged blades that launched themselves at him with a sound like tearing parchment. Elara's chest tightened as the soil reached her collarbones. This wasn't just resistance, it was retribution. The Whispering Willow's branches loomed above her, their leaves vibrating with a rhythm that matched the frantic hammering of her heart. She'd been so sure she could control this, so certain her curiosity was a torch rather than a match tossed into dry tinder. Now, as the roots of the willow brushed her throat, she understood the truth. Magic had allergies, and she'd rubbed pollen directly into its wounds. Neville's cry cut through the chaos as a snargle of vine wrapped around his ankle, yanking him off balance. He hit the ground hard, his wand skittering just out of reach. The venomous tentacula loomed over him, its maw like blossoms dripping viscous fluid that sizzled where it struck the floorboards. Alara strained against the earth, but it was no use. She was rooted as firmly as the plants she'd sought to master. Then, piercing through the cacophony, came a sound so unexpected it made the very air still. A melody, not from a wand, not from a spell, but from human lips, soft, steady, and ancient as the first seed ever planted. Professor Sprout stood framed in the shattered doorway, her hands bare, her wand tucked away, singing a lullaby in a language that prickled Elara's skin with recognition. The words weren't words at all, but something older, something that bypassed the mind entirely to speak directly to the green, pulsing core of every plant in the room. The effect was instantaneous. The tentacula's vines froze mid-strike. The flutterbee blades softened, curling inward like chastened children. Even the Whispering Willow's branches sagged, their furious trembling easing into something almost like shame. The soil around Alara loosened, spitting her back onto the surface with a wet, shuddering gasp. For a heartbeat, the greenhouse was silent save for Sprout's humming, the plants swaying gently now, as if the last few minutes had been nothing more than a bad dream. Then the professor's voice cut through the quiet, sharp as a pruning shear. You dug too deep. Her gaze locked onto Alara, and for the first time, there was no kindness in it, only the grim weariness of someone who'd seen this story play out before. Behind her, the greenhouse walls bore the scars of the battle. Shattered pots, oozing sap, deep gouges in the wood where vines had lashed out like whips. But the real damage wasn't to the glass or the soil. It was in the way the plants watched them now, their movements too deliberate, their silence too knowing. The door had been cracked open, and somewhere, in the dark beneath Hogwarts, something had cracked its eyes open too. Sprout's office smelled of damp earth, and something deeper ancient parchment, maybe, or the faint metallic tang of old magic pressed between the pages of forgotten books. Elara sat stiffly in the chair across from her, her hands still crusted with soil from the greenhouse, while the other professors loomed like storm clouds around the room. McGonagall's lips were pressed into a thin line, Flitwick's usual cheer replaced by a wary frown, and Snape, well, Snape looked as though he'd been waiting for this exact disaster since the day Alara set foot in Hogwarts. The plants were never just plants, Sprout began, her voice quieter than Alara had ever heard it. She lifted a gnarled hand, and the air above her palm shimmered, resolving into a vision. Towering trees with bark like carved runes, their roots cradling glowing orbs of light, while robed figures tended them with reverence. They were guardians, keepers of magic so old it didn't need wands or words. The founders called it Verdant sorcery, a partnership. The plants channeled magic through their roots. Wizards shaped it with intent. The image twisted. The trees grew jagged, their branches splitting into thorn tendrils. The orbs of light darkened, pulsing like infected wounds. Flitwick inhaled sharply as the vision showed vines snatching a wizard's arm mid-spell, drinking the magic from his very bones. Power corrupts, Sprout murmured, even green things. The more they took, the hungrier they became. By the time the founders acted, an entire village had been swallowed by the forbidden forest. Elara's stomach lurched. The skeletal remains in the hidden greenhouse. Had they been tending those plants when they turned? McGonagall's voice cut through her daze. Algernon Gorsewood's fate should have been lesson enough, yet you've nearly undone centuries of safeguards in a matter of weeks. Her gaze could have etched glass. Expulsion isn't merely justified, it's necessary. Snape's smirk was razor thin. Letting her remain would be like handing a flobberworm a lit fuse and hoping it doesn't notice. But Sprout didn't flinch. She reached into her desk and slid a vial across the wood, the same one Alara had seen in her visions, its murky liquid swirling with flecks of gold. "This isn't just a punishment," she said, tapping the glass. "It's a test." The original wards were woven with herbology and arithmancy, spells that need renewing. Who better to aid than the only student in 3 centuries who's heard the Whispering Willow's voice? Flitwick's eyebrows shot up. "You can't mean to." "I do." Sprout's eyes locked onto Alara's. The magic chose her, not because she's reckless, but because she listens. And right now, with the wards fraying, Hogwarts needs someone who can hear what the plants aren't saying. The vial glinted in the firelight, its surface etched with those same thorn-like runes. Alara's fingers itched to take it, not for redemption, but for the answer buzzing in her veins like a trapped hornet. If the plants had been guardians once, could they be again? Or was some hunger too deep to unlearn? Snape exhaled through his nose. "One misstep," he hissed, "and I'll ensure your detention lasts until the next Goblin Rebellion." Elara barely heard him. The vial was warm in her palm, humming faintly. Somewhere beneath the castle, roots shifted in the dark, and for the first time, she wondered if the wards weren't just keeping the plants out, but something else in. The stone circle behind the greenhouses had stood for centuries, its moss-covered slabs worn smooth by time and weather. But tonight, under the full moon's glow, the runes carved into their surfaces flickered to life like embers stirred by a breeze. Elara's breath fogged in the chill air as she knelt beside Neville, her fingers trembling against the cold earth. Between them, Sprout unrolled a scroll of parchment, so old it crackled like autumn leaves. Its ink faded to the color of dried blood. "The binding isn't about force," the professor murmured, pressing a handful of crushed moonstone into Elara's palm. "It's an apology." The ritual began with silence, not the absence of sound, but a listening quiet, the kind that settles over a forest when a predator passes. Elara scattered the moonstone dust in a wide arc, each granule glowing as it touched the soil. The Whispering Willow's branches shuddered in response, its leaves folding inward like hands clasping in prayer. Neville's voice, steady and low, wove through the night as he recited the incantation, the words less spoken than grown, sprouting from his lips like vines seeking sunlight. And then Alara felt it, not the invasive rush of the pollen's magic, but something softer, older. The plant's whispers didn't vanish. They settled, their frantic edges smoothing into something like a lullaby. The flutterbee bushes sighed, their leaves relaxing into gentle waves. The venomous tentaculous thorns retracted with a sound like rain on canvas. Even the whooping willow's trunk ceased its restless creaking, its groans fading into the contented hum of an old tree in the wind. But the true revelation came when Alara pressed her bare palm to the earth. The roots beneath didn't just quiet, they answered. Not in words, but in impressions. The slow, patient pulse of sap through veins, the deep ache of stones shifting over centuries, the quiet joy of sunlight after rain. For the first time, she understood. Magic wasn't a puzzle to solve or a power to claim. It was a conversation, one that had been going on long before her and would continue long after. As the final rune flared and dimmed, Sprout placed a gnarled hand on her shoulder. "You wanted to hear them," she said softly. "Now you know what they've been saying all along." The weight of it settled over Alara like dew, heavy, inevitable. The plants hadn't been angry. They'd been afraid of being used, afraid of being forgotten. And most of all, afraid of what might wake if their whispers were heard by the wrong ears. Neville's quiet chuckle broke the stillness. He held up a single, glowing seed pod, a gift, left in the circle's center by the willow. "Told you they'd forgive us," he whispered, but Alara barely heard him. Her gaze was fixed on the castle windows, where the faintest shimmer of gold pulsed behind the glass. The wards knitting themselves back together, stronger now, but not, she suspected, untested for long. Somewhere beneath their feet, the earth shifted, and the seed pod in Neville's hand pulsed once, as if dreaming. The greenhouse had never smelled sweeter than on that first morning back, not of magic or mystery, but of simple, honest growth. Sunlight pooled in golden puddles between the newly repaired benches, and the flutterby bushes rustled their leaves in what might have been greeting, or perhaps just the ordinary stirring of a breeze. Elara ran her fingers along the Whispering Willow's trunk, not to listen this time, but to apologize. Its bark was warm under her touch, its whispers softer now, like an old friend speaking across a shared silence. Neville found her there, his hands cradling a parcel wrapped in what looked suspiciously like enchanted ivy. The leaves shifted under her gaze, rearranging themselves into tiny, glowing runes. "For your notes," he said, pressing it into her palms. The moment her skin met the cover, the ivy unfurled, revealing a journal bound in what could only be Demiguy's hide, its pages faintly iridescent. "It's charmed," he admitted with a grin. "Only shows its true contents to someone who respects what's written inside. Took me 3 tries to get the spell right, kept sprouting thorns every time I tested it on Professor Snape." Alara laughed, but the weight of the gift settled deep. This wasn't just a book, it was a covenant. Every observation she penned now would be judged not by professors or rules, but by the magic itself. She flipped to the first page and froze. There, in Neville's sprawling script, was a single line. "The first rule of listening is knowing when to be silent." Beneath it, the parchment shimmered, offering space for her own words, but only, she suspected, if they earned it. The greenhouse door creaked open, and Professor Sprout entered, her usual basket of clippings replaced by a single, potted sapling. Its leaves were an impossible shade of blue, veined with silver. "A cutting from the willow," she said, placing it gently on the work table. "Consider it a reminder. Roots need boundaries to grow strong." The sapling's branches quivered as if in agreement, and Alara understood. This wasn't the end of her curiosity. It was the beginning of something slower, wiser. That evening, she wrote her first entry in the Enchanted journal, her quill moving carefully. Day 1. "The tentacula didn't hiss today." It sighed. "I think that's progress." The ink sank into the page like water into thirsty soil, and for the first time, the journal wrote back. a single word blooming in the margin, green as spring, patience. Outside, the whooping willow stirred in its sleep, its dreams quieter now, but no less deep. Somewhere beneath the castle, the wards hummed, their magic woven anew, not to silence the whispers, but to remind them they were heard. The last day of term dawned with a hush over the greenhouse, as if even the most boisterous plants knew something sacred was about to unfold. Alara knelt by the whispering willow, her fingers tracing the familiar grooves of its bark, one final time before summer's respite. Then, soft as a sigh, a single seed pod detached from its highest branch, drifting down like a feather caught in an invisible current. It landed in her upturned palm, its surface etched with delicate, spiraling runes that pulsed faintly gold, then silver, as though breathing in time with her own heartbeat. For months, she'd wondered if the willow truly forgave her, but this was no mere truce. The seed's warmth spread through her fingers, carrying with it something deeper than magic, an understanding, a recognition. Plants didn't speak in apologies or promises. They spoke in roots and seasons. This was their language, a gift given not because she'd earned it, but because she'd learned. The corner she chose for planting wasn't hidden so much as set apart, a quiet niche where the sunlight pooled thick as honey between the stone walls. As her trowel broke the soil, the earth exhaled a scent of damp peat and something older, a scent that reminded her of the first page of Neville's Enchanted journal, the one that had whispered patience in ink, the color of young leaves. She nestled the seed into its cradle of dirt, whispering the only words that felt right. Grow when you're ready. The moment the last sprinkle of soil covered it, the greenhouse seemed to inhale. The flutterbee bushes stilled mid-shiver. The venomous tentaculous vines uncurled like outstretched fingers. Even the whooping willow, visible through the glass, gave a slow, creaking nod. Alara sat back on her heels, her palms pressed to the cool stone floor. She'd spent so long chasing secrets, she'd forgotten the simplest truth. Some mysteries weren't meant to be solved, only witnessed. By evening, the first shoot had emerged no taller than a knuckle, its leaves translucent as stained glass. It didn't glow, it didn't whisper, but when the moonlight struck it just so, the runes on its stem shimmered like distant stars, spelling out a story too slow and too vast for any human tongue to tell. Elara smiled. However long it took, she'd be there to listen. The invitation arrived on thick parchment edged in gold, its wax seal stamped with an alchemical symbol Alara didn't recognize, a serpent coiled around a sprouting seed. The visiting alchemist's name, Vexley, was inscribed in looping script beneath it, along with a request to meet at the Three Broomsticks to discuss what he called a mutually beneficial arrangement. Rosmerta's pub was unusually quiet that afternoon, the usual chatter of students replaced by the low murmur of cloaked figures huddled over steaming tankards. Vexley stood out like a crow among doves. His robes were too finely cut for Hogsmeade, his fingers heavy with rings that gleamed with the same unnatural sheen as the Whispering Willow's pollen. When Alara slid into the seat across from him, he didn't offer pleasantries. "Your work with the willow is remarkable," he said, stirring his drink with a silver spoon that darkened where it touched the liquid. "But it's wasted here." He pushed a leather satchel across the table. Inside, vials of iridescent powder glimmered beside a stack of galleons tall enough to make her throat go dry. "A retainer," he explained, tapping one vial for samples, a leaf here, a root cutting there, nothing that would harm the plants, just enough to study. My patrons believe your discoveries could revolutionize magical agriculture. His smile didn't reach his eyes. Imagine it, crops that grow in barren soil. Trees that bear fruit year-round, all thanks to you. Alara's fingers twitched toward the satchel. The possibilities were staggering. No more starving wizarding villages. No more potion ingredients so rare they cost a fortune. But then she glanced at Vexley's spoon, again, now blackened to the handle, and remembered the way the greenhouse vines had shrieked when she'd pushed too far. Magic like this wasn't meant to be bottled and sold. It was a conversation, one that demanded respect, not exploitation. She slid the satchel back. The willow isn't a laboratory subject. It's a teacher. Vexley's smirk curdled like spoiled milk. How quaint. He snapped the bag shut, the coins inside clinking like a death knell. Hogwarts has always been too sentimental for progress. A shame. As he stood, his shadow stretched unnaturally long across the floorboards, twisting like ivy seeking purchase. When you change your mind, and you will, my offer stands. Until then, his gaze flicked to the window, where the whooping willow's distant silhouette swayed against the dusk. Sleep lightly, Miss Thornbrook. Not all roots stay buried. The door slammed behind him, leaving Alara alone with the dregs of her butterbeer and the creeping certainty that she'd just passed a test she hadn't known she was taking. True wisdom, it turned out, wasn't in unlocking secrets, but in knowing which doors to leave closed. Outside, the first stars winked awake above the castle, their light catching the edge of something silver tucked into Vexley's abandoned chair. A single thorned leaf from the willow itself, glowing faintly, as if in approval. The greenhouse hummed with a quiet energy as Alara walked between the rows of plants, her fingertips brushing the leaves like old friends. The Whispering Willow's branches swayed gently in a breeze that didn't exist, its murmurs softer now, less like secrets and more like shared confidences. Summer sunlight pooled in golden puddles across the stone floor, and the air smelled of damp earth and something sweeter, like the first breath after a storm. She paused beside the sapling she'd planted, its leaves now the size of galleons, their edges shimmering with those same mysterious runes. It hadn't spoken yet, not in words, but sometimes, when the moonlight struck it just right, she could almost hear it humming. Neville's Enchanted journal lay open on a nearby bench, its pages filled with sketches and observations, each entry a testament to how far she'd come. Not just in understanding the plants, but in understanding herself. There were no more reckless experiments, no more midnight raids on the restricted section. Just patient, careful listening. The tentacula no longer hissed at her approach. Instead, it curled a vine around her wrist like a handshake, its thorns retracted. Even the flutterby bushes, once so skittish, now rustled their leaves in greeting, their whispers weaving into the greenhouse's quiet symphony. Professor Sprout had been right, of course. Magic wasn't a puzzle to solve or a trophy to claim. It was a dance, one where every step mattered. Alara knelt beside a pot of freshly repotted Mimbulus Mimbletonia, its quills trembling as she tucked a bit of nutrient-rich soil around its roots. "There you go," she murmured, and the plant let out a contented sigh, its spines relaxing. It was moments like these that reminded her of the most important lesson. Knowledge wasn't just about uncovering truths. It was about honoring them. As she stepped out into the evening air, the castle loomed ahead, its windows glowing like fireflies. Somewhere beneath those ancient stones, the wards pulsed strong and steady, their magic woven anew. The plants would keep whispering, and she would keep listening, but this time, with the wisdom to know when to lean in and when to step back. The path ahead was still uncharted, still brimming with mysteries, but she wasn't afraid anymore. After all, the best discoveries weren't the ones you forced. They were the ones that grew.